Hey everyone, thanks for joining today for today's panel by the Quincy Institute, which is Dark Money in U.S. Foreign Policy. And your moderator today will be Eli Clifton. My name is Adam Weinstein, and I'm a research fellow here at the Quincy Institute. And if you're not familiar with the Quincy Institute, it's a think tank that is committed to developing U.S. foreign policy that is more rooted in restraint and diplomacy than intervention and conflict. And your host today, Eli Clifton, is an investigative journalist at large at Responsible Statecraft, which is a publication affiliated with the Quincy Institute. And he's a senior advisor at the Quincy Institute. And his work focuses on money in politics and U.S. foreign policy. He has an extensive publication history. You can go to his profile page at Responsible Statecraft to find it. And he holds a master's in international political economy from LSE in London. And without further ado, I will pass it on to Eli. Thank you for joining today.
Thanks, Adam. Concerns about dark money influence over U.S. foreign policy have emerged as a concern across all branches of government. And I think that gives us sort of an interesting starting point for a panel today. The National Intelligence Council has expressed alarm about efforts undertaken by the United Arab Emirates to influence U.S. policy, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. The Justice Department has taken a renewed interest in enforcing the Foreign Agent Registration Act, both through criminal prosecutions of alleged violators, as well as an attempt that was ultimately unsuccessful last year to compel Steve Wynn to register as a foreign agent of China via a civil lawsuit. And Congress, perhaps where the most visible efforts are underway, has introduced a variety of legislation to address the hidden financial influence of foreign interests. These include the Think Tank Transparency Act that would require disclosure of foreign funding by think tanks, and the Fighting Foreign Influence Act that would require similar disclosures from think tanks, but also ban retired senior military officers and executive branch officials from lobbying for foreign principals. And it would take a variety of steps to prevent foreign funding from entering the campaign finance system. Furthermore, efforts to strengthen the truth and testimony disclosures for congressional witnesses would mandate greater disclosure of what would otherwise be unseen foreign and domestic financial interests that may pose a conflict of interest with their testimony. Needless to say, a lot is happening. Now, excuse me. Our panelists today include Washington Post national security reporter John Hudson, editorial and investigations manager at Open Secrets, Anna Masoglia, Vox senior foreign policy writer Jonathan Geyer, and political researcher and freelance writer Brett Hines. The format is going to be pretty simple today. I'm going to ask each of these panelists, these experts, a question. We'll give them an opportunity to respond. And once they have each answered a question, we will open up the conversation and take some questions from the audience. Moving right along, John, as I referenced in the introduction, last November, you reported about what is, to the best of our knowledge, I believe, an unprecedented classified report by the National Intelligence Council. You wrote that the report, quote, reveals the UAE's bid spanning multiple U.S. administrations to exploit vulnerabilities in American governance, including its reliance on campaign contributions, susceptibility to powerful lobbying firms, and lax enforcement of disclosure laws intended to guard against interference by foreign governments, end quote. I'm sure that the UAE isn't alone in exploiting various vulnerabilities in our political system, but what does it say about the intelligence community's assessment of these vulnerabilities if they are writing classified reports about a close Gulf ally? Do you think they see this report as part of a unique threat from UAE, or is it part of a broader systemic problem?
Yeah, well, I think a few things. What it does say, I mean, this is quite unusual for the National Intelligence Council to do something like this. So just to take a step back for a second, the National Intelligence Council is sort of the premier analytic hub of the U.S. intelligence community. It writes reports and it sort of speaks with one voice on what the entire U.S. intelligence community is seeing, observing, and what it views. It's pretty common for the National Intelligence Council to do reports on adversaries like Russia and China and Iran, who are all involved in political interference in the U.S. Political system. But what's just extremely unique about this, and a lot of the people that I talked to while reporting on this, is how rare and in some cases unprecedented it is for the NIC to do a report on a U.S. ally. And what it revealed is how differently some of the U.S. intelligence officials talk about a close U.S. ally, how they refer to it in private versus to how it's referred to in public, which is really praised. The UAE is talked about as sort of Little Sparta, a really key strategic U.S. ally that really benefits U.S. national security interests. And this report really spelled out in extensive ways how the UAE is manipulating the U.S. political system. Some ways fairly mundane things that people have gotten accustomed to in terms of so much foreign government spending in U.S. think tanks, U.S. universities. But ways that are more akin to espionage as well. So the whole gamut of things. To your question about this being, a systemic thing. I do think that broadly, this is something that we're used to seeing done by U.S. allies. So sort of, we think about it done by adversaries, but it's actually more commonly done by U.S. allies. There's a few reasons for that. One, U.S. think tanks, they don't really want to associate with adversaries. These are a lot of people who have sterling sort of academic backgrounds and professionals who don't want to be seen as doing research that is, directly, funded by governments like Saudi Arabia or Russia or China. But they are much more comfortable taking money from countries viewed as allies or having a sort of benign sort of interest. I do think that when it comes to that, foreign influence in the United States, and especially the sort of influence industry in Washington, that is where it's coming from the most. Adversaries have different ways of influencing, and a lot of those are often, illicit. But it doesn't mean that it's not worth tracking both types of influence campaign.
Thanks, John. And for those of you in the audience, feel free to drop questions, comments into the Q&A in your Zoom functionality. Now, turning to you, Anna, your focus on transparency and dark money spans both domestic and foreign actors, and I should say for open secrets as well, and these actors' efforts to quietly influence the U.S. policy debate. Now, I know this is a big question, but at a systemic level, where are the greatest weak points for foreign or domestic actors seeking to influence U.S. foreign policy in an opaque manner? And what are the most important steps being taken, be it in Congress, the judiciary, and the executive branch, to address what is effectively dark money efforts trying to influence U.S. policy?
Sure, that is certainly a big question, and there's no real single answer to it in terms of a fix for all of these ways that foreign influence spending is seeking to influence U.S. policy and public opinion. One of the things that we track at Open Secrets is the Foreign Agents Registration Act filings, but really the filings are only as good as the people filling them out. And so without stronger accountability systems, without enforcing the laws on the books, in many cases, you have significant gaps. That's something that's really improved over the last few years at the Department of Justice that administers FARA, where we are seeing more of a crackdown on actors who are not registered as foreign agents, but are acting in a way that is representing other countries. We are seeing some of the laws on the books really starting to be enforced over the last maybe 5 or 6 years, along with some very high profile foreign agent cases. But there's so much more that can really be done, where we're seeing late filings almost constantly. You have retroactive filers of up to 10 years that we've seen. And that really doesn't speak to the spirit of the law, where so much of the information should be disclosed, but is not. And I think that that's a really great first step towards ensuring transparency, is just enforcing the laws on the books. There's certainly many other ways that both Foreign Agents Registration Act issues and Lobbying Disclosure Act issues could be addressed, as well as other means of foreign influence. So in addition to just this traditional lobbying, you're seeing attempts to influence public policy and public opinion through FARA that might not necessarily look like traditional lobbying, where the average American public member would be the target audience. And you also have, of course, groups like 501c4s that provide a vehicle for effectively opaque spending in US politics. And because we don't know who is behind these groups that are supposed to function for social welfare, but can spend millions of dollars on US politics, it could be foreign actors and it may not be, we really don't know. And so more disclosure around all of these different areas and ways that money is able to seep either into US elections or into influencing policy is extremely important. But unfortunately, there's no singular fix to that.
And if I may, just sort of a brief follow-up question, you've referenced the late filings under FARA and what seem to be just sort of low levels of compliance. Is this something that you see across the spectrum in areas that are not so focused on foreign actors or on foreign policy, or is there a particular impunity in that space because perhaps it's been less scrutiny on it?
Enforcement of FARA has been uniquely lax over the years, where we saw decades where very few cases were ever brought, where there was very little enforcement. But starting around 2015, 2016, we really saw those enforcement cases start to ramp up and be more on par with the dysfunction of other government agencies. I can't say that it's not limited just to FARA, that there is lax enforcement, that there are late filings, there are omissions, but it was uniquely problematic for a number of decades and has only recently started to be addressed. The Department of Justice has made great strides with addressing both a more active enforcement of the laws on the books and also addressing potential changes in guidance. I know that they have started to release information about form updates so that they can be more standardized, which can make the information easier to process and more accessible. And also other changes, they were soliciting comments last year and looking at ways to improve FARA, and have really at least started to address the issues where it's not just going after cases and lawsuits, it's also making sure that the laws are adapting to the times, especially now that so much of these influence operations is virtual and the laws were not necessarily written to account for a number of the new means like influencers that are really spearheading some of these efforts. And of course, there's a number of types of activities that just aren't covered by either FARA or the LDA that still could potentially be addressed in other ways.
Thank you. Now, Jonathan, I know you've reported extensively on West Exec Advisors, shedding light on the host of domestic and foreign clients that the consultancy has. And many of the employees of West Exec, as well as some of its founders, have cycled back into the Biden administration. Now, zooming out for a moment, what lessons should we take from the clear pattern of some of America's top diplomats and policymakers cycling in and out of private sector consultancies such as West Exec, and there are others? These consultancies aren't terribly transparent about their client lists. And as you've reported, while West Exec says they don't take foreign government clients, they are partially owned by Teneo, a consultancy that does take on foreign government clients. So stakeholders in West Exec, one would think perhaps are indirectly benefiting from Teneo's business for foreign governments. Do these private sector consultancies who have few obligations to disclose their clients, do they pose a growing problem? And if so, what are the implications for US policymakers, for US foreign policy and national security? And is this creating financial entanglements for top policymakers?
Yes to all the above. No, thank you, Eli, for bringing together all these really great experts and reporters here, because I've been really focused on the dark money that I think is being driven by corporate interests and affecting U.S. foreign policy. So we know that Secretary of State Tony Blinken, along with about 30 others from his firm, have gone in and out of the Biden administration. And for example, Secretary Blinken was a consultant for Facebook, LinkedIn, Microsoft, Uber, a host of startups who work on military tech. And what I'm particularly interested in is the secretary can visit Silicon Valley and can speak to this kind of influential set of startup and venture tech folks and isn't asked about this work. It kind of falls off his bio. So I've been very interested in how most people in Washington who are policymakers or former policymakers. They hold think tank jobs and academic jobs, and those are what they get cited for. And it tends to fall off of their bios that they also work as corporate consultants. So I've been trying to really highlight that in my reporting. And it's a, it's a difficult story to tell because it's so ubiquitous, it's so structural, as you say. Members of the consulting firm WestExec are not just in state or the White House, but USAID, Department of Defense, Treasury, DOJ, DNI, DHS, CIA. It kind of affects every aspect of government. And there's a host of other consulting firms that engage in similar type of work where we only learn about their client base due to necessary financial disclosures, which are tough to read. And it becomes a kind of Talmudic task to read between the lines and guess, that Jen Psaki, the former White House spokesperson, was working for a Israeli facial recognition software company doing crisis comms, but we don't know the exact shape of that work. So one thing I also want to surface in this set of questions is the venture and investing work that a consulting firm like WestExec has done. They started a new venture capital firm that invests in all these startups that do military tech. We don't know a whole lot about them. And there's also something called the Pine Island Capital Partners, which Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin was a partner, as was Tony Blinken. It's an investment group. And I just remember reading a story early in the Biden campaign saying, we're going to be hearing a lot about these kind of groups because so many powerful members of this administration are coming from them. And unfortunately, we just haven't. I think the press, excluding the folks in this Zoom room, very few people have, shined a torch in an ongoing basis on how clients of various consulting firms are benefiting from their close contacts with former well-known consultants who are now in government.
And a brief follow-up, what could you speculate? I think that's the most I can ask for here about why that is. Why is this something that is not more broadly discussed? The idea of money in politics, and this is something I've wrestled with quite a bit and some frustration around, the idea of money in politics and special interests being present in politics is pretty accepted by the American public, by the media. This is something we talk about, and by politicians. We talk about this pretty openly in nearly every other contested policy space. And yet with foreign policy, this is often not the way that it's talked about. And there's nearly sometimes seems to be a resistance to doing so, and the idea that maybe politics ends at the water's edge, some notion of that. But I can't quite put my finger on why it is that we don't talk about it as being, hey, this is dark money, these are special interests. It's a contested policy space. There's nothing special or different here. We're not even saying it's dirtier necessarily. It's just American politics being itself. Why is it that there seems to be an aversion to that discussion?
I think what you've identified, Eli, is this huge structural issue that, former US diplomats and national security officials, they go into the private sector, they'll work like Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, as a corporate consultant for Uber, the ride-sharing app. And it's not exactly the A to B of lawyers going in and out and representing clients that they wrote laws about. It's like a few steps away. It's a complex story. And these are very intelligent former policymakers. So they themselves, I think, are very cogent about the appearance of conflicts of interest, do a very good job of following all the ethical guidelines. But I think what you're trying to say is those ethical guidelines really aren't up to snuff for dealing with a systemic issue whereby almost every major policymaker has worked for corporate clients, and we just don't have a complete picture of who those corporate clients are or what that work actually looks like.
Thank you. Now, Brett, turning to you, influence over U.S. foreign policy, particularly in steering policymakers towards arms sales, for instance, and exports, isn't limited to foreign interests. The U.S. is the world's largest exporter of weapons, and U.S. weapons firms shower think tanks in Washington with funding. Now, your 2021 report, the Military Industrial Think Tank Complex, looked at potential conflicts of interest between a major Washington think tank and its funding from a host of individuals and corporations with direct financial interests in U.S. weapons sales. Now, putting aside some of the thornier legal questions that John Hudson and Anna Masoglia have explored, What are the ethical implications of these potential conflicts of interest? Are think tanks, particularly in the foreign policy space, abiding by the standards of conflicts of interest avoidance and disclosure that are commonly employed by academics, journalists, and scientists? And if they're not, why do you think that is?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say on a whole, think tanks are largely have failed to apply themselves to the same ethical standards that you see even among major newspapers, not to mention academics or scientists or something of this sort. Many think tanks simply just don't reveal what their funding sources at all. They're under no legal requirement to do so. So there are some major organizations which simply we just do not know what the interests are when they're advertising certain ideas to policymakers. But even among those who do provide some level of information about what their funding sources are, it's extraordinarily rare for them to provide disclosures on reports or on publications or testimony to Congress that actually brings up when it is relevant when there are conflicts of interest. And because of the fact that they don't really hold themselves to these same sort of ethical standards that you might see even in an average newspaper column, it makes it a lot easier for special interests to use them as intermediaries for lobbying policymakers towards certain ideas. So the report that we wrote looked at one particular think tank in Washington, D.C., the Center for a New American Security, who over the last decade or so has taken money from about 30 military contractors, many of the largest corporations in the United States, and over a dozen foreign governments and international institutions. And what's more, they give a lot of these donors direct influence over the type of research that they're doing by giving executives from these donor institutions a spot on their board of advisors. So we know that they're in contact with the people who are funding them while they're writing research that is relevant to the people who are funding them. And we went across a number of examples where this sort of thing becomes very tangible as a conflict of interest, and you could see it happening in real time. So there was one particular instance where they published a report calling on the Air Force to purchase a significantly larger amount of B-21 stealth bombers. And at no point in the report, they acknowledged that the producer of this plane, Northrop Grumman, is consistently one of their largest financial supporters year after year after year after year. So when you're reading this report, you wouldn't ever actually know this. If you're a busy legislative assistant on Capitol Hill, you're just seeing this report from what is supposedly a neutral source of expertise, and you're adding it to your bank of knowledge as to what smart policy might look like. You'd actually have to go into their donor list and then dig through and find particular instances of each individual year to see who's funding them in order to figure out these conflicts of interest. So even when they are being transparent, they aren't actually being fully honest when they're trying to influence policymakers as to what some of these conflicts might be and as to what ulterior motives they may have when advertising particular forms of policy. And unfortunately, for some institutions, this lack of transparency may be the point, because the easiest way to guarantee continued funding is to guarantee that you will remain a source of access to influence for these policymakers without ever sacrificing this image of neutrality that you've built.
Thank you. Now, there's an interesting question here that I think I'd like to from the audience, I'd like to pass on to Anna, which is, it's a big question, and I think there's some things baked into this. And it's which think tanks get the most money from foreign governments, which governments are involved, how much money do they spend? Please give examples of research that was funded by foreign governments. So that's a big question, and I'll throw that to you. But I do have a slight add-on to that, which is that how comprehensive is the information we have about foreign funding of think tanks, the funding maybe generally of think tanks, and how thorough are the disclosures that we do get?
So one of the issues with tracking money that's funding think tanks, whether that be foreign or domestic, is that there's no real legal requirement for nonprofit entities to disclose their donors. Outside of certain contexts, if they're engaging in certain special activities, there may be additional requirements, but for the average nonprofit, whether that be a 501c3 think tank or a C4 that's spending on advocacy, they're not legally required to disclose their donors. While some think tanks and other nonprofits do voluntarily disclose their donors, the level of disclosure and detail really has a wide range depending on one nonprofit to the next, where some of them may only disclose the ranges of their receipts rather than specific amounts. They may not disclose all of their funders. So you're really relying on them to be forthcoming that these are actually all of their funders, and there's no real consequence if, for example, a think tank only disclosed some of its funders, but not others. And unlike political committees, unlike campaigns, there really isn't that requirement. There are some efforts to really reform truth and testimony forms for when think tank officials are testifying in front of government to get those additional disclosures, in particular about foreign funding. But there is no one-stop shop to find all of the funders of think tanks. There are some researchers that have looked into it, but there's no comprehensive database in the same way you have with political filings or lobbying filings. And think tanks are also one of those areas that is an exemption from FARA in many cases, where under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, if you're just providing research for scholarly efforts, and again, that's a bit of a term of art that can be interpreted multiple ways, that's something that's not disclosed under the Foreign Agents Registration Act either.
Thank you. And I will say, as a journalist who tries to cover this, that there is a widespread misconception that there is mandatory disclosures of funders, both for think tanks as well as all 501c3s. There's often a belief that the 990 tax disclosure or IRS disclosure that 501c3s file includes that information. It does not. It shows where money goes. It doesn't show generally where it comes from. So I think we've all actually on this panel reported on think tanks and their funders. It's often, as Anna just explained, the exceptions nearly where we actually get to sort of peek behind the curtain about the funding. It's not comprehensive, and it's pretty hard to say with certainty about, well, who's the biggest recipient of foreign funding when we really have no comprehensive way of knowing. This is another thorny question about perhaps the legalities of FARA as well as influence in Washington. I think this is a good question for Jonathan. Why shouldn't APAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, be beyond FARA? I assume the question is about why doesn't APAC need to register under FARA, given its name and interest in U.S.-Israel policy?
That is indeed a thorny question. I don't think I could speak directly to it, but I'll say that there is this whole nonprofit network in Washington that have very ready-made quotes and policy papers and experts that, are easy to call upon. And they often have very defined interests, even if they are operating with particular inclinations. And what's interesting, I think, is APAC, the Israel lobbying organization, has had a kind of staying power in Washington for decades, but so many other organizations have modeled themselves after that, beyond foreign policy, but also including Middle East advocacy groups, whether it being J Street, which advocates for a two-state solution and has been more critical of Israel, and any number of organizations with bents that maybe support the United Arab Emirates or are pushing for human rights in a positive way, but learning lessons from AIPAC's pretty excellent advocacy on the Hill and to the executive branch. So I have become obsessed with FARA, as I think many of us are in this room, because it's such an interesting law. It's sort of not exactly designed for the age of social media, not exactly designed for a moment where it's really easy to influence US elections, US media, US policymakers through not that much effort. So I do think that's a bigger trend line to explore here.
I think this next question would probably be best sent over to you, Brett. Is it at all realistic, given the history of K Street influence peddling and its analogs, to believe government and by extension U.S. politics would be less confrontational by more aggressively restricting the flow of money from foreign sources? And I would add to that question, domestic sources as well, who have a financial interest in a hawkish U.S. foreign policy, which would include presumably the weapons companies that you've studied.
Well, that's a good question in the sense that there seems to be a lot of debate as to how one could even effectively regulate money in politics in the first place. It seems as though every time there's a comprehensive overhaul within 10 years, there's 30,000 new ways to get around the comprehensive overhaul. But I would say that if it were indeed possible, and I have my own ideas, as I'm sure everyone on this panel does, to actually be able to restrict the amount of special interest money flowing into the US political process, then yes, it would actually probably be the case that there would be less pressures on policymakers to take particular actions in a more militaristic or interventionist direction, especially when that sort of policy action aligns with the profit incentives of arms companies or aligns with the national security objectives of a lot of these foreign governments who are trying to influence the US policymaking process. It's really simple in the sense that they are spending money to try to influence US foreign policy in the direction of greater intervention. So if they had less ability to do that, there would be less influence campaigns and less pressure, and most likely as a final result, more peaceful foreign policy.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to add to that if you've got a second. I think there's a real incentive structure set up like that. And I think you can recall, I think during the Obama era, there was a lot of think tank scholarship and a lot of emphasis from, again, sort of US allies about America withdrawing, America retrenchment in US foreign policy. And a lot of times these were from governments that wanted more active U.S. foreign policy in their region, whether that's the Middle East or Europe or elsewhere. So you can definitely see how the U.S. foreign policy could be more confrontational with those types of inputs coming in. I think there's a case in maybe there's a counterexample you could say where, you know, lobbying and influence from a business perspective could push U.S. foreign policy in a less confrontational approach in situations where you know, this is theoretical, but you know, you could bring up China as a case study where you would have the U.S. business community seeking smoother relations between the two powers. It's complex, but I do think in most cases what we've seen is examples of foreign governments trying to push the United States into a more active foreign policy and a more aggressive foreign policy.
Can I jump on that too? Because I think that's a really interesting point, John, because one of the offerings of West Exec Advisors, the firm founded by Secretary Blinken, was kind of managing risk in this great power competition moment with China. So I see this really smart question from your colleague, Eli. Gordon Adams has asked this question about, you know, what are the actual conflicts of interest here? And it's really hard to kind of drill down on how working for one particular client affects a particular policy. I mean, you really have to be in the room, and we all do our best to get the documents and to speak with the players. But one example, just thinking about how John laid this out, is how if you were working as a corporate consultant for a major multinational corporation that's trying to navigate China policy, how does that impact the way that you as a government official a year or two later is making China policy? And do you end up kind of internalizing some of the questions of the big tech company, of the bank, of the defense contractor that you were consulting for? Now, obviously, I'm not saying anything illegal is happening here. I'm just saying, is there a bias? Is there a kind of absorption of the interests, of special interests of corporations in US policymaking just based on what folks have been doing in the off season when they're out of government?
You know, one way I'd like to sort of add on to this question, maybe throw it back to you, John, is, you know, so often I see a very casual way of talking about U.S. policy and U.S. interests that suggests that there's that it's synonymous, the interests of be it a weapons company or a foreign government with U.S. national interest. And it seems like it's done very smoothly the way that pivot occurs, because obviously there is a logical, you know, rupture there between, you know, a country on the other side of the world, the United States, may have different interests. It's just, you know, the facts of geopolitics for you. It's not anything against that country or against the United States. Or a U.S. weapons firm may have slightly different interests than the general population. Do you see that as a trend in the way that U.S. policy gets talked about, way policy recommendations are made, especially from think tanks and that may have funding from these other sources? And in your own reporting, is that something that you see as being important to call out? And is it a challenge that you face, is explaining that, hey, you know, interests are not synonymous necessarily?
Yeah, I think good journalism does tries to correctly spell out what the federal government is doing to benefit people, and which people is it benefiting. And you do hear these arguments a lot in Washington in general about whether it's U.S. policy towards Israel or Egypt or Ukraine. When there are criticisms about how U.S. Military assistance is doled out, sometimes you'll hear defenders say, "Hey, look, this is going to U.S. companies. This is going to U.S. contractors. It's not as if this money is just going to the budgets of foreign governments that you may or may not like." The question you could ask or at least underscore is that the U.S. government is then giving a sizable amount of taxpayer dollars to a specific company, or organization. What is that doing for Americans who are concerned about the cost of milk or eggs, or any other sort of domestic concern where U.S. Taxes are going towards a private interest as opposed to a public good. The point is not to say these people are deserving, those people are undeserving, but you have to be clear about where that money is going to and who is benefiting, and I think that's important for journalists to spell out.
I'd like to jump in that real quickly, just because I think that you've hit on something really important, which is something you actually see in a lot of these think tanks, especially of the variety that are sort of pushing for a more interventionist foreign policy, where there's this very clever sleight of hand in which they say, oh, well, the strength of the United States comes from our healthy and our robust and our growing private sector. So therefore, the stronger the private sector is, the stronger the United States is. And this suggests that anything which is beneficial to these large corporations based in the United States is therefore good U.S. foreign policy. And it's incredible how often that sort of pops up when you start looking for it in the way that these kind of conversations are happening. And what's interesting to me is that regardless of the direction that any of this money is trying to push policy in, even in situations like the financial industry trying to de-escalate with China, the fact of the matter is that these decisions are being made based on corporate profit incentive and not on matters of public policy making and of public interest and public concern.
Thank you. I have a question here that I think probably would be best answered by John and possibly followed up by Jonathan, if we can chain this together. And the question is, what are the implications of foreign, quote, dark money in the US for American, quote, dark money in foreign countries? And now getting into more specifics here, the question is, what are the implications for US interests abroad if foreign countries employ similarly harsh FARA type laws? Is there a golden rule of foreign influence laws? In other words, US has interests abroad, no doubt US companies, US government tries to influence foreign policy in other countries. Are there risks here? What are the implications? What are the consequences of trying to crack down to some degree or another on dark money here?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I'm not an expert on the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, but this is something that you certainly hear U.S. companies and corporations complaining about significantly, saying that they are hemmed in significantly when they're trying to do business in foreign countries, and they're worried about falling prey to this, and it sets them back when compared to their foreign competitors in those countries. That argument being that in foreign countries you have to sort of grease some palms to get anything done, and the onerous requirements that law puts into place makes things quite difficult for U.S. corporations abroad. Now that's just a common complaint that you will hear. That's one example of a U.S. law that sort of will have some limiting force on what our companies do abroad. It's a specific question. It's a very interesting question. I'm not an expert in this, so I don't have that much more to share other than, clearly U.S. laws can impact how our companies work abroad. And, even, some might say, where FARA has, fallen short when it comes to foreigners influencing the U.S. political system. There are, at least there is a capacity in the United States to have laws that limit what our companies do abroad. I'm sure many people say, they would like it to go farther, and clearly, as I spelled out, someone have to go less far. But absolutely, definitely interested what Jonathan has to say on this topic as well.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things come to mind that I will try to put together cohesively, which is, of course, the United States has an incredible international assistance arm, some of it through the USAID Development Agency, some of it through these kind of funded nonprofits, the National Democrat Institute, the International Republican Institute. And, when I was based in Egypt reporting, the Egyptian government, wholly cracked down on a lot of US funded, I wouldn't call it dark money, but US assistance programs. So I don't think that's what anyone in this conversation is advocating for when we're talking about FARA and clarity and foreign registration. It's not to crack down upon dark money in the sense of sending people to prison, which is what unfortunately happened to some of my peers in Egypt who were working for US funded initiatives. I think we've seen something similar happen with various initiatives in Viktor Orban's Hungary and sort of US nonprofits working abroad. They fall into this ire of governments and are treated as if they are US influence agents. I think really what we're all interested in is there is a huge amount of foreign money and corporate money in the United States, and it ends up defining what the US is actually doing abroad. And there isn't always so much clarity on where that money's going, how it's being spent. And I mean, this would be a sort of different nitty-gritty conversation about who has to register for FARA. Those filings, I think, are quarterly. They have to reach a certain threshold. I was, essentially being lobbied by Ukrainian fighter jet pilots last summer, and I learned that the person who had hosted the dinner with these fighter jet pilots who were Ukrainian, encouraging us to send F-16s to Ukraine, was an unregistered lobbyist. So I think this is the part we're interested in, is this sort of these people operating in the margins, advocating for foreign interests, whether they're so-called good guys, as some might call the Ukrainians, or they're very much bad guys, adversarial, or they're sort of in between and they're just countries that are advocating for their own interests. But I do, maybe to tie it all back together, because there is such an intensive game in Washington among these warring interests in think tanks and officially registered, it kind of flies back abroad into the sectors and countries where the US operates. So you have something like the Kohelet Forum, this nonprofit based in the United States that played a role in drafting the Israeli judicial overhaul that's roiling that country right now. So there is a kind of give and take where the lessons of foreign influence in the US end up kind of ricocheting and having effects on how the US operates in the world.
I would love to weigh in as well. So one of the trends that I found so fascinating to follow, and I believe John mentioned this a bit earlier, is the spread of foreign agents laws across the world. And one of the criticisms I've seen of FARA in the US is how broadly written it is, and how you can oftentimes have a very similar law in another country implemented extraordinarily differently. And while some of the countries that are implementing these foreign agents laws or foreign lobbying disclosure laws do have disclosure in mind, are improving the disclosure in their countries, are increasing accountability, there is also this other motivator in certain other countries where the laws on the books look identical to these transparency focused and accountability focused laws, but can be weaponized in order to crack down on free speech, to crack down on journalism, to crack down on dissent in these countries, and are really following in the path of Russia and a few other countries that are really starting to in some cases use a very similar law in a very different way. And so there are two sides to the coin, whether it is great that there is increased transparency in some countries, but there's also the trend of these laws being exploited for the purposes of perpetuating the same corruption that they were intended to resolve.
Thanks, Anna. And I'd actually like to come back to you with another question. Two questions. I'm going to try to combine them. And Brett, feel free to jump in at the end of Anna's response as well, because I think some of this will touch on areas that you focused on. My colleague Ben Freeman asks, well, what can be done about all of this dark money in U.S. politics? Are there specific reforms that you think would be particularly helpful? I think that's a good question, because we've painted a pretty bleak picture here. So it'd be great to get into, well, what are some very targeted specific things that might actually be realistic, that could be imposed? And the other question comes from Mike Amate, and I think this may connect to this. And he asks, is it realistic to expect bipartisan support in Congress necessary to pass legislation addressing foreign dark money influence?
Both great questions. So at Open Secrets, we're very careful with what regulations or legislative changes that we are able to endorse. We limit that to just pro-transparency regulations and in a nonpartisan fashion. And so we're very limited with the types of policies that we're able to either promote or speak on as being positive or negative. But there certainly are some changes that I've seen proposed that can be helpful, things like standardized. And again, they're more of the boring proposals, since it's the areas that we're able to talk about, but certainly standardization of data within the system to make sure that it's running more efficiently. E-filing is something that would be really helpful, I think, with the Foreign Agents Registration Act, where up until a couple of years ago, we were still seeing filings with Sharpie marker, and it makes it so much harder to be able to search the documents and ultimately hold those actors to account. And those are just a couple little steps, but that can ultimately enable a better working system to be able to pave the way towards those other reforms. As for the partisan nature of addressing foreign influence and foreign policy, we have certainly seen efforts from both sides of the aisle, but in many cases targeting different countries. There are certain countries that are of interest and seen as more of the danger for Democrats as for Republicans. And one of the challenges is really finding a piece of legislation that works for both. Ultimately, they are pushing for the same types of interest, which is preventing foreign interests from impeding in American politics, from interfering. But in many cases, you do see, for example, Republicans being more attracted to China and the threat that China presents. Democrats in many cases have focused on Russia recently, and these are just because these countries are very in the news. But finding a common threat that appeals to both sides, I think, is really important in order to be able to get them on board to push these reforms that they both see necessary with separate reasoning.
I would agree with a lot of what Anna said, especially at the end there. We've actually seen a pretty encouraging amount of bipartisanship on some of these issues, at least. So, for example, the Think Tank Transparency Act was introduced by Senator Chuck Grassley, the Republican from Iowa. And as Anna noted, they sort of come at it from different angles. It seems like Democrats are looking at this sort of from a transparency, good government angle, whereas a lot of the Republican legislators are looking at this sort of from Chinese influence in American politics and such. But frankly, the Think Tank Transparency Act is a pretty great piece of legislation, in my personal opinion. So regardless of the different reasons that people are coming at it, I think solutions like that, which would require think tanks to disclose a lot more of their foreign funding, are a great first step. There's a lot of other very concrete ideas that are immediately available as well, well short of any sort of comprehensive overhaul. So truth and transparency regulations were mentioned. There's a big push right now to update those and require people testifying to Congress to disclose their conflicts of interest a lot more. I also think that an interesting issue here is one that's sort of in the executive branch's ability, which is to limit the amount of waivers that are provided to former military officials in serving as foreign lobbyists for a lot of countries. And there was famously a big controversy about this last year when the former president of the Brookings Institution stepped down over controversy over not filing what was, according to the DOJ, probably foreign lobbying on behalf of the Qatar government. So I think that a lot of these regulations, just to sort of bring greater transparency and to bring shine a brighter spotlight on a lot of these conflicts of interest, is a very good concrete first step.
Jonathan, I wanted to send the next question over to you, which is sort of a combination of a domestic political question as well as a foreign policy and national security one, which is, why do we Americans support an insane military budget? I suppose that's subjective, but $850-something billion careening toward $1 trillion does seem like a lot, that is larger than the next 10 countries combined. Is this a reflection of genuine U.S. national security interests and concerns, or is this is my own addition to the question now, or is this partially at least the function of some kind of careful lobbying from interested parties?
Well, it's a great question, and it's one of the first stories I wrote for Vox. Is why is the military budget still growing even though the U.S. has no more troops in Afghanistan? And I think a lot of people type that question into Google because that story from over a year ago still gets a lot of traffic, which always surprises me. But I do think we cannot understate the influence of major defense contractors and a new wave of military startups who are all very closely linked to current and former policymakers in shaping the needs and the wants of this budget. And it is quite interesting to me that Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin was on the board of Raytheon, one of these major contractors. And so, technically he has to recuse himself from any number of policies directly affecting Raytheon for this 2-year period, which may have passed. But so it just goes to show how much U.S. National security budgets and interests are shaped by these corporations. Now, perhaps the most revelatory example I've seen of this was the Ukrainian embassy hosted a party, kind of like a holiday party in December. And the logos of many of these defense contractors appeared on the invitation that I was able to obtain. So it had, Raytheon and Lockheed and Pratt and Whitney, one of these major aerospace makers. And I believe Northrop Grumman was on there as well. And it just goes to show how intimate the relationship is between the U.S. as well as some of the countries, the U.S. has provided tens of billions of dollars of security assistance to Ukraine. So it is a cozy relationship. And I think drawing it out and showing who the winners and losers are of these budgets is really crucial.
And I'd love to add one thing to that, is that the cozy relationship that you mentioned, I think, is something that's not even limited just to Ukraine. It's very much something that we've seen in multiple different countries where we have arms deals happening, where the US is one of their main exporters for arms. Saudi Arabia is a great example of that, where you are seeing the foreign interests and foreign governments' lobbying efforts really going in line with the defense industry lobbying, and in some cases even having the same lobbyist. So you're effectively having the same person going and meeting with these members of Congress on behalf of both a foreign government as well as a defense industry actor. And you don't just have this expensive lobbying spending, you also have political contributions that can really help grease the wheel for those policy changes.
John, if I can turn to you again for a moment, you raised earlier in one of your comments that, well, it's true that obviously major weapons companies and defense contractors have a vested interest in certain policy outcomes, but so too do folks who could be on the other side of that equation, be it sort of business interests, that, as the example you provided, who might want to have a more engaged relationship with China. And I guess the question I would like to pose to you is, I completely see that point. I think it's a valuable one, but we also have a track record to look at here, which suggests that it seems as if some pretty relatively small interests, when you talk about the amount of money that, for instance, gets spent by the United Arab Emirates compared to the amount of money on the line for companies that are doing business with China, let's say, seem to still, with that smaller amount of money and a narrow set of interests, be able to exert a high degree of influence over U.S. policy, or at least that seems to be the case. And it seems like the National Intelligence Council was expressing some concern about that, perhaps perceived or real outsized influence. What is sort of the competitive advantage, if there is one, of these narrow interest groups, be they foreign or domestic, that are pushing often towards greater weapons exports or more hawkish U.S. policy?
What is the competitive advantage over business interests?
Yeah, who may be, I guess, more disparate or for whatever reasons are not organizing in the ways that, well, you presented as that, that they could be. And they may in some cases, but it seems like the trend for US-China, let's take it as the example, is toward greater confrontation?
Well, one advantage I think that foreign governments have when it comes to exerting influence is, long-standing ties and this, this tendency of really nurturing a wide array of individuals who are influential when it comes to U.S. foreign policy making. Those can be our career diplomats, those can be political appointees, but there is a natural incentive for our diplomats and our government officials who specialize in a certain region. It could be anywhere, it could be Europe, it could be the Middle East. And oftentimes, a lot of their relevance and a lot of their value is what can they do within their own bureaucratic structure during a time of crisis. Maybe you have Americans who are trapped somewhere or detained somewhere, and we need help from a Middle Eastern government, European government, a Southeast Asian government to get them out. And so, a lot of, there could be an incentive for a government official to, use those contacts and say, look, I came away with a big win. But cultivating those contacts over time sometimes will involve a give and take. And there will be a desire for diplomats, government officials to, the sort of crude term that comes up to sort of going native and seeming to look out more for the governments that they've served in contrast to other things, potentially the U.S. interest. That's something that I think foreign governments can cultivate over time, developing those strong relationships in a way that is different because they have the advantage of exploiting sort of national power as opposed to a business entity that has a lot of money and is able to hire an army of lobbyists to push and pressure, and then hopefully get some sort of change in U.S. policy that benefits them. I know there were some questions about what specific policies are resulting from foreign influence, and it can be hard to point from point A to point B specifically, but one of the things that we pointed out in our story on the UAE, there'll be a lot of national security officials that say, this is a government that helps advance U.S. interests. But there'll be others that have said, to what extent does giving the UAE the most sophisticated weapons in the U.S. arsenal serve U.S. interests? Some who are advocates of Israel have said, giving the UAE the F-35, giving them powerful drones, limits Israel's qualitative military edge. And if it weren't for the UAE's very effective influence operations in the US, they wouldn't be getting, sign off on some of these very powerful and sort of jewels in the crowns of sort of the US arsenal. So that's one area where people would point, from point A to B. It's sort of an art; it's not a science. But those are some things that I would point to in terms of this question of who has the competitive advantage, foreign governments or businesses.
Thanks so much. We are at the top of the hour, and unfortunately, we're out of time. Thanks to the audience for the questions you've submitted. Apologies for those we didn't get to. Thanks to this great panel, Brett, John, Jonathan, Anna. This has been fascinating. I really appreciate you all taking time out today to talk about a topic that I know we have all researched, reported on, and find to be of great interest. So thank you so much. Adam, back to you.
Thank you, Eli. It's been really interesting, and for me, what's been most interesting is just to explore this revolving door that happens between consulting and government, and what the implications of that are, which we should be able to talk about openly, but sometimes it's for some reason taboo to talk about that openly, and it shouldn't be. I'd like to draw your attention to an upcoming event. You can find it on the Quincy Institute website if you just go to Quincy Institute or quincyinst.org, but you can Google it and it will come right up, and go to the events tab. It will show, but it's the MIT Star Forum, Grand Delusion, The Rise and Fall of American Ambition in the Middle East. And that's a recent book published by our own Stephen Simon. This is actually an in-person event at MIT, but you can watch it via webcast as well. So please check that out. Thanks for joining the Quincy Institute today, and I hope you all will come back in the future for future events.